Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are gathered tonight with our friends from the Auburn Avenue Research Library to celebrate America Goddam, Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, written by Dr. Treva B. Lindsey. Dr. Lindsey is a Black feminist historian and associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at The Ohio State University. She is the recipient of several prestigious fellowships, including the ACLS Mellon Scholars and Society Fellowship, the Equity for Women and Girls of Color Fellowship at Harvard University, and the Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship. Dr. Lindsey is the founder of the Transformative Black Feminisms Initiative at Ohio State and the co-founder of Black Feminist Night School at Zora's House in Columbus, Ohio. Her latest book is the book we are celebrating tonight, America Goddam, and it explores contemporary violence against Black women and girls and how they mobilize to halt violence against them. Her first book is Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C., and it was honored as a Choice Outstanding Academic Title of 2017. She is joined today by one of our Charis faves, Kiese Laymon, who is a Black Southern writer from Jackson, Mississippi. He is the author of the novel Long Division, the multi-award-winning memoir Heavy, and the essay collection How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America. So always a pleasure to have you here, Kiese. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much. I was saying in the green room to Dr. Lindsey, this is a book that no fewer than 6 people were like, you're gonna host Dr. Lindsey, right? Like, you're gonna have this book. So it's a wonderful thing when so many people, different parts of our community, are so excited about a book. And obviously it speaks to the importance of this book and the subject matter, but also to your scholarship and your skills. So it's really a delight to have you here, and welcome to everybody watching at home. Feel free to shout out in the chat where you're watching from. You can also ask questions, put them in the ask a question box, and Kiese will weave them in as he is wont to do when it makes sense to do that. So I'm gonna get out of the way. Thank y'all both so much for being here. It is really a nice thing to have you with us on a Sunday night.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here with Charis, and I'm triply, quadruply hyped to be here with Dr. Lindsey. You know, like, Dr. Lindsey is fam, intellectual fam, spiritual fam, but also we collegiate fam.
Yes.
I came to Oberlin. I left Oberlin, I think, a little bit before you got to Oberlin.
Right. Yes.
And so in these kind of conversations, I have to make myself be extra professional because my impulse is to be super colloquial with you. But I want to ask this question before we really get into it. And I've been reading your work and hearing about your work ever since I left Oberlin. And I want to talk about the wonders of it maybe in a few minutes. But I'm so interested in what you did with this book structurally. You ended with a letter to Ma'Khia Bryant. And I'm interested in, like, can you talk about what made the decision to end it with that letter versus beginning it with that letter? We don't get into a whole lot of stuff, but I just been thinking about that since I read it months and months ago. I love that decision, but I'm interested in how and what brought you to that decision.
Yes. Well, first, thank you so much, Charis, for hosting this conversation. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I am a fan, and whenever I'm in the A, I'm always there, and I order my books from Charis, our OSU, that's our WGSS partner. So thank you for creating a space for this conversation. And Kiese, always such a pleasure to share space with you, share ideas with you, and to just be in the space and think with you. It's such a pleasure and an honor. And hello to everybody out there who is watching. So it's interesting, right? The book was done. The book was in production. And I'm sitting in a hair salon, and it's the day that the Derek Chauvin verdict comes back. And he's found guilty of the murder of George Floyd. And we're in the salon talking, as Black folks want to do in the salon. I'm hanging out a little longer because I'm just starting to get back into the salon at this point, still masked up and everything, but in Black space. And I start seeing little alerts and messages that a police shooting has happened in Columbus. So this is literally the same day. And I'm thinking in that moment, as I heard the verdict, my immediate thought went to Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old Black girl who filmed the murder of George Floyd and her cousin. And that was like, I just immediately thought of her. And I was like, I wonder if she's going to sleep any better tonight, knowing that she had said that she wakes up at the night thinking how much she could have done if she could have done something else to help George. And I'm looking and I'm trying to figure out what's happening because I'm getting these alerts, I'm getting these texts. And suddenly I realize a cop has killed a person, a cop has killed a Black person, it's a teenager, it's a Black teenage girl. And as these details become clear, and we're now only an hour out from this verdict being read, that I'm mortified, I'm heartbroken, and I just know because the immediate thing that comes out here is that she's armed with a knife.
Right.
And so I knew that she was going to be maligned. I knew that she was going to be seen as disposable. I knew that people were going to justify this. And I knew people who were just celebrating this verdict were somehow going to find a reason to malign this little girl.
Right.
And so I thought about it for a while. I gathered with folks in town. I'm gathering with organizers and we're thinking, and I just reach out to my editor and I'm like, I think I have to write about this. And I think it needs to be in this book. She's like, it's in production, but I can hold the production for a little bit and we can add this in, but I'm going to need it in the next 48 hours. Yes. Right. To make sure that we have this. And so the form that it took, as opposed to trying to contextualize or anything, was this love letter.
Right.
And I think ending the book in that way for me was one, the reality of how close to home this hits and the urgency and the consistency with which Black girls are combating death-dealing forces and running up against them. And also the worlds that I want to fight for. I want to fight for a world where she's still here making dope as fuck TikTok videos. I still want a world in which she's laying down her baby hairs and gets to turn 18 and is cared for and is not caught in the violence that is the child welfare system. I want those things for her. And so it gave a very concrete way to say, this is the world that I'm fighting for. I'm thinking about that and thinking alongside her and having the permission of her family to do that.
And you know, I didn't know that. And as we read the book, you know, I'm astounded by the levels of intimacy that you get to, you know, the various subject matters and, you know, various kinds of violences. I think you do an incredible job of historicizing so many violences, but also like giving us new names for understanding different sorts of violences. And you start the book, you know, being from Mississippi, and I'm one of Mississippians. Anytime I see Mississippi, I'm gonna be excited. You know, right? Ain't good with it or not. But you know, you start talking about Nina Simone and you know what led to Nina Simone's Mississippi. Goddamn, that was incredible for me to know. I did not know half of that history, and I thought I knew all the history. And then you write about Medgar Evers briefly. Medgar Evers got shot like, you know, a mile and a half from where I went to school. But then you write about Addie, Carol, Denise, and Cynthia. And you're adamant that we actually have to say those 4 little Black girls' names. And you say this sentence, which sort of is the opinion on which this narrative sort of like rests. You say, I don't reduce Black women and girls to only being casualties of violence, although the focus of this book is violent encounters. I wonder if you can talk about the necessity of that sentence so early in the book, right? It's not, you're not asking people for forgiveness, but it seems very important that you say that early. I don't reduce Black women and girls to only being casualties of violence, although the focus of this is violent encounters. Can we talk about that for a bit?
Absolutely. So for me to say that I wanted to handle Black girls warmly, taking a cue from Ntozake Shange and for colored girls, was to say, how am I going to do that as a practice as I write this book?
Right.
And for me, that not only meant I only come to know most of the girls, women, and gender expansive people in this book because of the violent encounter. But prior to that moment, they're loved by someone.
Yes.
They're in community. They move through the world. Some of them were brownies, some sang, some played instruments, some got in trouble a lot of time at school, some loved playing double dutch, like whatever it was. And I really looked to find them beyond the violent encounter. Because I didn't ever want anyone in this book to be reduced to an object of study that is used to illustrate a point, but rather a call in for us to understand the stakes of what this means to fight for, that we lost out on beautiful singers, that we lost out on folks who committed to these things. And, the 4 little girls, what happens if they become 4 Black women, if that's who they want to become? And aging Black women, they become our elders. Instead, at such a young age, they become our ancestors. And I think it's really important in that to trace a little bit, and to the extent that I could, who they were as life affirmed in flesh people. And for me, that is a different path than just saying, here's the encounter, it was awful, now this illustrates this data set that we're aware of. It is absolutely an intentional choice to say they are loved, they were loved, and they'll forever be loved by those who were in community with them. And we can think about them symbolically and illustratively, but that even evacuates a level of personhood.
Yes.
And I wanted to find a way to ensure that their personhood was never left or cast aside in the way that would ever snuff them out did.
And I'm just taken so much by your desire for readers of your book, right? Which has violence in the cover. Goddamn, followed by violence, Black women and the struggle for justice. But I'm taken by this sort of desire and urge and plea for us early in the book to see these women and Black women and girls and gender fluid folks as folks who survive, who live these unlivable violent lives, but live these unlivable violent lives.
Yes.
Can we talk about the juxtaposition between what you call unlivable living and the necessity that we understand that there is still some living being done in that unlivability? Can we talk about that?
So it's one thing to talk about Black people's lives and only talk about that in relationship to structures and systems of violence that are wearing them down and predisposing us towards premature death, right? That the way that then death becomes equated with Black living. Right. And so I really wanted a way to think about how people not just persevere, because that felt incorrect too, but to name the systemic harm that is in there, that it is in fact unlivable. And yet, because we are amazing and wonderful and loving and create communities and create alternative spaces in which we find care for each other in a world that seems to be so careless with us, that is a form of living that I wanted to affirm, right? I was thinking of Kevin Croshy's work of Black aliveness. And it was important to me that in spite of the book having this heavy content and talking about this, that I'm already practicing the kind of freedom I want to see by living through these things and building community and loving and creating intimacies that do that. And I wanted to show as many instances as possible where we see that, whether it's the Moms for Housing in Oakland seeking to create a space in which they could thrive and live in, despite not having the resources and despite the state saying, you can't have this. That somehow there are these living practices and these freedom practices that emerge among Black folks in spite of doing it. So unlivable living is holding those systems accountable. You're creating a context of unlivability. But guess what? We're still living. We're still aging. We still got elders. I mean, we have a reverence for our elders, right? In our community. So that means people are making it to elderhood.
That's right. That's right.
It means we're living. And I never want to silence or erase that. Right? Because that, again, reinforces a politics of disposability that I didn't want to be a part of how I was telling the story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let me just say, let me just encourage you all, if you have questions throughout the talk, please put them in the question and answer section down there at the bottom. We'll try to weave them in. Also, I just want to take a pause because what you just said about the unlivability and Black aliveness in spite of and because of that unlivability, I just think, we should pause and say, give as much love as we can to our sister Regina Bradley. As much love as possible as we can, Regina Bradley. I see you out here hyping us up in the audience. We love you, Gina May. We definitely love you. Yes, and so and again, since I've been reading you and hearing people talk about you now going on like almost 25 years, right? Because when I left Auburn, Auburn's one of those places like when you leave, people tell you about the people who rock it. Right? And people often talked about you as like this person who was genre list, like who you could do so many different things, but was like highly driven. I'm interested in like this sort of like intellectual drivenness, which helps create a book like America Goddam.
Mm-hmm.
But also, and again, this sort of is about structure, but also about the way you implicate yourself in this book. There's a way this book could have been written where we don't know anything about you other than what you think about the topic. Can you talk about the elasticity that you demand of this form and why this particular subject actually like has to be coded in that elasticity?
Yes. Oh, I love that question. Thank you. So, right, I'm a historian by training. So the archive is where, that's where I reside. And I love telling the story, seeing the thread, talking about genealogy and legacies, etc. And I really could have written this book very distanced in certain ways and just looking at the archive, looking at more contemporary examples of what I was talking about. But in some ways that felt dishonest about what the stakes are for me and the intimacy I wanted to create with the book. I think a lot about this book that comes through is I wanted it to feel like you were in a room with me. Yeah. And I was just talking to you about this. So that is going to be a little bit of history. That's going to be a little bit of analysis. There's going to be a little slippage into like, girl, now that shit was crazy, right? It's going to be in there. And I think that it was really important that that book had that. And I felt that one of the best ways to do that was to talk about the stakes of it for me and say, look, I'm asking us to bear witness. I'm asking all of you to do that. But I'm with this. Like, this is my experience. These are experiences of people I love and care about. And I need us to fight because, like, it's snuffing us out. It's snuffing me out. It's killing me. So I don't want to pretend to be objective about this. I don't want to pretend that it's just an archive that people tend to think of as past, as opposed to a living archive that we're adding names and stories and communities to day in and day out. And so having that connection of putting myself in there and putting myself as a lens into these different places, I was hoping would also have the reader feel that as well. Yes. Because it is such a heavy book. And so I'm in it with you and experiencing the heaviness with you as I'm reading it. And I hoped that that helped you move through and gave you somewhat of like a companion as you're moving through these data points that are harrowing, right? You read of something, it's like 44% of Black girls will experience unwanted sexual touch before they're 18. That's a really heavy statistic to sit with. But it's better when we think about the colloquial ways in which we talk about fast-tailed girls and dirty this and dirty that, and the level at which we normalize sexual violence and sexual predation against Black girls. And so having that moment where I'm doing both, it's the data, it's the history, it's the archive, and it's these personal moments of reflection that I think help us understand the gravity of the stakes and how it affectively right? A historical book could have been very effective. Yes. I desire to be both effective and affective with this project.
Better let them know. Okay. Let me ask you this question. Because I think in deciding to be effective and affective, you actually, like, for someone like me who's very much in the sentences, the sentences like echo two different ways. Like, there's a sentence in the book that says the violence of police reaching into and beyond our home in death-dealing ways. And I was just really taken by the idea of policing, like reaching into and beyond in death-dealing ways. And you talk about later, like not non-fatal ways. But that sentence is complicated by how you describe your father and your relationship with your father earlier in that chapter. Right. Like and it feels to me like that's risky for the genre. And that's one of the reasons I love this book. But I don't even know if it's risky. But I also wanted to ask you, like, are you taking a risk writing yourself into this book in ways that make sure the sentences cannot be read singularly? The sentences have to be read in a multiplicity of ways because of what you do with what people call autobiographical. But can you talk about, like, did it feel risky to do that kind of work?
I was a little like, I don't know if this is going to work, y'all. Like, I didn't know whether it was going to work or whether that would make it less like if people would take it less seriously or see it as less this, because like, well, of course she feels that way because
Right.
she mentions the dad and the death dealing. I'm like, or I could write it in a way where they're making some of the connections and leading them to certain connections being made. And to think about those death dealing ways, right? Like the invocation of my father was twofold, right? Is one of the first persons who told me I could write this book and passed away before it was published. And so it was important for me to include, like, how did I really learn about policing? I learned it from my father, right? And him our drives, listening to NWA. That's a real
incredible
memory.
Incredible.
I have my father, who at the time worked in law enforcement.
Yes.
Right. And so there was an acute way for me to say, like, I've always had an understanding of policing, in spite of my father being law enforcement, that he was intentional about, you're not going to be officer friendly. That's not who you're ever going to encounter. And that though he wouldn't have articulated it such, there were ways that he's preparing me for the onslaught of the ways that patriarchy and white supremacy and anti-Blackness and anti-poorness via the lens of capitalism were going to show up in my life, right? And he wouldn't use that language because that wasn't language he would have used. But he's like, Black girls are real vulnerable out here. We see what they do to people who live in our neighborhood, who are living with various addictions, and how they're treated and the names I hear them called. No human involved murders or robberies or attempts, is how they would literally talk about sex workers and people living with addiction. And so my father saw that and gave me language at a very young age to be able to think through that, so that when I see an instance like Ayanna Stanley Jones being killed laying on her grandmother's couch, or Breonna Taylor being asleep and being killed, or Deborah Danner or Eleanor Bumpers, or I could go on and on and on of the number of Black women and girls who are literally killed in their homes by police, that bringing it to my home first and my experience coming out of that was a way to frame that kind of violence and the ways that, you know, the spheres in which we want to feel like we made it home, right? Like you text your friend and let them know you made it home, right? Because that's allegedly the safe place, right, for you to be. And there was an acute awareness that home was not, for all kinds of reasons, whether that's from the state or, you know, intracommunal violence, intimate violence, domestic violence.
It's such a I mean, I think all of us would use the word powerful, but it's just such a propellant way to cast this, like, you know, momentous book. Like, you know, like you let us know early on that there's a subtext, and there's a subtext to that subtext. And y'all gonna have to do a little work. I'm gonna do a lot of work for y'all motherfuckers, right? But y'all gonna have to piece some of this together too. And I'm leaving it out there. Tied to that, Gina May Regina Bradley asked this question that is tied to what I'm saying. Could you talk about the significance of defining and recognizing the sonic lives, interiority, illegibility of Black women and girls? Could you talk about the significance of defining and recognizing the sonic lives / interiority, illegibility of Black women and girls?
Yeah. So the book was originally called Hear Our Screams. So it had a direct sonic implication. I think when I first presented on it, and my girl Regina was there at Harvard, when I was a fellow there was this, like, hear our screams, hear the sonic things. And what I realized is those sounds, those screams, we're actually not hearing, right? It is because such a high percentage of Black femicide is occurring outside of public view. So much of the non-fatal and fatal violence that they're occurring. And so what we hear are the stories afterwards and whatever narratives come out of that. And so a narrative that emerges out of the killing of Eula Love, for example, is the common language that we use now of officer-involved shooting.
Right.
That historical origin is so deeply tied to the murder of this woman over an unpaid gas bill in her front yard. And so we don't have a sound that is attached to that. We just have the narrative, we have the news reports, we have these other ways. And so we don't get the videos, we don't have the cell phone videos, we don't have these firsthand encounters that get reported back. We have only the silence that happens in the aftermath of the death and the lies that form the larger kind of sonic backdrop of these murders, which I think in many ways leads to a certain level of illegibility. And that it's not happening in these spectacular instances, but rather in these spaces that we feel are non-spectacular, such as the home, such as driving home and then someone asks you to remove your tampon. These quiet indignities, as many would call it, but are absolutely death dealing as well. And connected to that. And so when we do get something of a sound, or you don't have this "I can't breathe" moment, you don't have the last few minutes of young Trayvon Martin's life, or the sonic landscape of Jordan Davis being killed for having his music too loud, right? That there's ways that sound is operating. It's just the gunshots.
Right.
Just the gunshots. And the narrative that spun around that. And so I think that it was really important for me to think about what it meant that we don't get to hear those screams, and how that shapes the ways that we respond to the pervasiveness of violence against Black women and girls.
Yeah. And you introduced this idea to me, which I should have been introduced to it before, but I wasn't, which is non-fatal police violence, right?
Yeah.
And the particular ways that non-fatal police violence impact the life of Black women and girls. Could you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah. So one of the things that the second most common form of violence that we see police misconduct coming up on is sexual misconduct, right? So I'm looking at that data. I'm like, well, I really haven't heard a lot about this. I wonder why that is, right? And one of the first kind of public pieces that I wrote for Cosmopolitan and doing this 3-part series was about an now ex-police officer who was a serial sexual predator, who was targeting Black women and girls, and particularly ones who had records within the criminal punishment system that he was targeting, and anywhere from 17 to almost 60, right? And the range of people that he was sexually violating. And that story prompted me to dig deeper into these records and to dig deeper into this, because there was no collective database that existed that would tell you about these instances. But it also meant looking at my own story of being sexually assaulted by a police officer. And knowing that of all of my experiences with violence, that was the one I really had never been able to tell anyone. And I didn't figure out why, because it felt to me like, oh, this must be exceptional, because this is not the kind of police violence that we rally around. It's not a beating on camera. It's not a murder. It's not an unarmed person in the alleyway. It's be on the side of the road being sexually assaulted. And I didn't know where to place that. But I suddenly, as I looked at the data and looked at these recurring things, saw the pervasiveness of sexual violence as the ways that, in particular, Black girls, women, and specifically Black trans women were encountering police officers, the kinds of violations that they were subjected to that fed from all kinds of harmful and horrific stereotypes about Black femininity and Black womanhood and Black personhood and Black gender variant personhood that was needed to be felt and interrogated and pushed. And that left me with so much shame. And so part of writing about non-fatal police violence for me was, this is another leg of Me Too, right? Like of opening that up in that space and opening up more space to talk about the various ways that policing is violence. When we say policing can be, and we're mincing words, policing is violent, right? It's redundant. Policing is literally an institution that is grounded in violence, and particularly patriarchal, white supremacist, xenophobic, anti-poor violence, and ableist violence, right? Because anywhere from a third to a half of folks who are killed by police, right, who identify as disabled.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I mean, you know, I think you do a great job of not making ableism like additive in this text. You know, like ableism is essential to understanding America, goddamn, like which might sound easy, but I think those, I mean, it's easy to make something additive that has become additive to our intellects, but you make it foundational because it is foundational. Right?
You can't talk about the violence that Black women and girls face without talking about ableism. You just can't. You can't talk about policing and violence without talking about disability justice and the work of Disability Justice Act. I mean, they've been ringing the alarm on a number of things, and from everything from COVID and our responses to it, to the environment, to the built environment. But when you look at the sheer numbers of Black women who have been gunned down or physically harmed by police, and match that, right, with how we think about disability justice and disability injustice, it's just harrowing. Like, so many of the women and girls that I write about were in mental health distress at the time of encounter, and no one cared, right? No one cared. I mean, that goes into that careless care of the medical industrial complex, whether we're talking about the physical well-being and health or our mental, the emotional and psychological well-being and health, right? The disregard for that can be fatal. And I wanted to be really intentional and influenced by such amazing Black disability justice folks in particular, but the broad range of Mingus and Sammy Shalk and Beanie. Like, they helped me think through this so much once those numbers, because I would get the data and then I just find the story, right? So I find this 33 to half. And I'm like, what in the world? So what does this mean? And what does this mean to think about policing as an anti-ableist, right? An ableist. And anti-Black. And if it's anti-Black, chances are it's going to be ableist. Chances are it's going to be anti-poor. Chances are it's going to be misogynistic and patriarchal, because white supremacy relies upon all of these interconnected systems to operate at full force in the lives of marginalized people.
And you do it in this fine way that does not necessarily like you complicate what people call, quote unquote, disability, but you do not make Black womenness and Black womanhood a disability, like traditionally as one reads or has seen it. But this is an important question, because this goes into a chapter where you explore some of this a bit more. And I have a few more questions I want to add onto this. But Vidya Barnett asks, can you expand on the section, "They need us to be disposable"? And what can we do to counter and fight back the effects of indirect murder of Black women and girls?
That is a large question.
It's hard. That's a big one.
An important one. Such an important question. But I think that need, if we think about, and this is why I named capitalism in the book, right, as a death-dealing force, because when we think about the origins of this nation that is so intimately tied to the productive and reproductive labor of Black folks with gestational capacity, that in fact means that we are being worn down and we are in this phase of consistent exploitation, and yet consistently marginalized, dispossessed, maligned. And so the war against that in many ways begins twofold, with the practicing of freedom that we do already, the creating of care in spaces where we can. So I always hate the phrase, "no one cares about Black girls," because Black girls care about Black girls. And we're not no one, right? So I don't ever want to feed into that. And so some of this is investing in the ways that we've already learned from our ancestors, of collectives, of how we respond and create these other systems, which doesn't mean we don't war against these systems are intact. But once we understand the rottenness of these systems, that these systems are predicated upon being murderous towards us, I feel like we can divest from our investments in those and seek to build the kinds of things and the systems that are built on care. It's hard to expect a medical industrial complex that's built on the exploitation, experimentation on Black women and girls to care about us or believe we feel pain. That's going to be really hard to do. Now, we can advocate, we can push, we can highlight, which I hope books like this, books like Dorothy Roberts, forthcoming books from like Uche Blackstock and Harriet Washington do, right, to push us in that direction. But I believe in building, and I believe in caring for us in the now so that we're creating other kinds of futures. We can make demands of these systems, but I also believe that our living and thriving is predicated upon our abilities to care for one another. I believe we are what we need for justice. And I believe we've seen that. We have examples of that in Black communities who've come before us.
Yeah, and one of the things you do in that chapter, and in so many, well, actually, like in I think 3 chapters specifically, is, the first time I read this book, I thought, damn, a lot of people are gonna be asking for some answers, right? Like, well, how do we, right? And I think that's because you define and you describe us and these systems that we are walking through and fighting so well. but you also do this thing where it might be the first time I've understood divestment from a structure as investment in another kind of like movement. And so like, but I don't know if that's absolutely true. So like, can you talk more about the importance of divestment from particular like things that we have invested in, and the necessity of also, while divesting, investing in other kinds of structures with completely different constitutions? So this is a tough question to me, but I wonder if you can tease it out for me a bit.
Right. Yes, it is a tough question. And so this book is also a project of me and thinking about where I was when I started this research, which still had some carceral impulses with regards to how we handled these things, right? Still had some investment in the criminal. At that point, I would have said the criminal legal system that I felt was unjust and all of these things, but body cameras and this and right, that definitely had that impulse. And as I'm writing this book, the more I'm digging into abolitionist reading, gender abolition, prison abolition, police abolition, the book is also mapping my own journey as someone who's a student of abolition. And so for me, this idea of divestment was important for me as much as it was, right, the processes of unlearning. What I demand of all of my students is that they be open to unlearning. Learning is the easy part. When you've never known something and then you get new information, it's kind of exciting.
Right.
Unlearning as a process means not only do you have to displace something that you've invested in for so long, but it also feels like you're displacing the people in the institutions that taught you that, or distancing yourself from relationships that matter to you.
Right.
Because you learned it from them. So does that make that person dishonest? Does that make them untrue? Does that make them less compassionate? What does that mean? And that often is harder to detach from. Something or a space that you felt was a caring space for you that I'm now putting into some kind of question, right? That I'm now saying, maybe it's not so great that X happens. And so divesting from systems means we have to think about what it means to be in different kinds of relationships.
Yes.
And different kinds of intimacies. And so that means intimacies with people perhaps who've harmed us. That means intimacies with people who are failing but trying. That means intimacies with ourselves and recognizing our failures and a kind of self-reflexivity. That at the very root level is part of divestment. But carceral logics, we internalize those, right? The various ways we internalize punitive responses to everything is something that requires a certain kind of unlearning. And so I imagine why it's very hard, because that's a question I get. So what are you going to do with all the rapists, right? You're a sexual violence advocate. You're just saying you want to abolish prisons and police. I'm like, prisons and police are sites of rape and violence. What are we even talking about here? We make jokes about people being raped in prison and jails and detention centers, right? We make those jokes. We've internalized a particular logic that someone is deserving of being sexually harmed. And so in that thing, I'm asking us to think about that. And so there's this long list of organizations at the end of the book who are invested in various ways in doing that work that requires us to first divest, because you have to divest to imagine. Because it's hard to imagine a world without prisons when you're invested in a belief that only prisons and police can keep us safe.
Right.
And that the only way to deal with harm is to punish.
Yes.
And if the point is you don't want someone to harm again and you want to have some kind of restorative relationship with the person who's been harmed, what does that look like? And what does it look like to know that we're sending them into systems that are death dealing and replicate harm and in fact intensify harm and ravage our communities? And so for me, that idea of divesting and investing is a process of both unlearning and then opening ourselves up to learning new ways of engaging with one another.
Right.
And that starts with just the question, why do you believe prisons work? Why do you believe policing works? What is safe for you? Right? And you'll notice I don't use safe a whole lot throughout the book.
Right.
Safety is entrenched in carceral logics quite often. And so what does it mean that you feel like you're in a space where harm is reduced?
Yes.
And that we can interact with one another in a different kind of way.
And I've been thinking a lot about the utility of the book in this carceral system, right? Like, lots of the people we know like create books that one would say or argue are there to help this divestment.
Yes.
And we know the paradox of capital means that sometimes when you put things in cardboard, things with really great covers on the front, and you mass market them, you might be complicit in, if you're complicit in capital, you might be complicit in a different kind of carcerality, no question, right? And so I'm interested in it, and I think this book makes it okay to ask this question: is how do you, right? Like, you are someone who I look up to, right? Like, how do you actually go about the work of daily divesting in the work? And I'm not talking about what you do in your personal life. I'm saying, how do you divest while working, right?
Yes.
Like, while working is a question I feel like this book wants me to ask you.
Yes. So part of it in writing it, and this goes back to an earlier question you asked about why I included myself in this book. So it's asking, for the folks who harm me, what do I want? What do I want it to happen?
Yeah.
And I need to reimagine that, right? Because in all of the instances that I talk about, no one was quote unquote held accountable, right? For the harm that they caused me. And I thought about, in the book, I discuss a friend of mine who's killed by her partner. And I've written about this earlier, but, he is charged, he's incarcerated, and I'm still not sure what that means in terms of justice, right?
Yeah.
I'm uncertain that means the thing we think it means. And I say that with trepidation because, there's the fear of what that means of saying, so you think nobody should be held accountable for what happened to her? Like, is accountable through carceral logic the only way that I can think about accountability? And what does it mean that it's so difficult for me to think beyond the carceral in response to this?
Mm-hmm.
And that is some of where I remain in this space, right? Like, I don't have all the answers. I know what doesn't work. Yes. I know what's producing more violence. I know what's criminalizing and destroying our communities. I know what's set up to continue to pathologize our communities and to death deal in our communities. So why is it so risky to imagine something else?
Mm-hmm.
Right? When I see the death toll that's been left by what's in place here, and with all that evidence, why remain wedded to that? And so I check my own impulses, right? When I see, like, I looked at my reaction to the Derek Chauvin trial, right? I looked at my reaction to when there are these non-indictments of these police officers. And those are the easiest to be so incensed about, because it's like, of course the criminal legal system doesn't recognize when you step out of black life, right? That feels that. But why do I'm even vested in the criminal legal system, knowing how rotten it is at its inception? And so I want a world in which these people are still here.
Right.
So I have to really think about, even that incarceration doesn't change that George Floyd's family will never hold him again, will never talk to him again, and his child will never play with him again. Like, that's the reality of it. No verdict changes that. And so I want a world in which in the future that doesn't happen to his own child.
Yes.
Right. And so that actually requires me to sit with my impulses and to reach to my imagination, because my impulses are my gut reaction to it. And my gut has been shaped by a world that is just hell bent on criminalizing and devouring.
Yes.
So now I have to check that and lean into my imagination more intentionally to do that. And so that has been my ongoing kind of practice in learning, growing.
Yes. And I'm really interested in, you I think define death deal. I mean, you define death dealing and redefine death dealing and redefine it, and you just recast it in these ways that just like are like masterful uses of repetition to inform me. So much so that you described ways that Black women and girls experience like unlivability and violence so particularly that it actually made me almost want to lean more up on this representational model, which is like, because Black women and girls have caught so much hell, if I see one win, everybody's winning, right? Like,
everybody's winning.
Like, talk to me about
the
impulse, because I think your book argues that one can understand the impulse of representational politics.
Absolutely.
But your book says there's a but and an and. And I wonder if we can talk about that.
There's always a but and an and, right?
Yeah.
So I thought about this, and of course, this week with the confirmation of
Right.
and I was like, there were a few people who wondered like what my thoughts were, why I hadn't posted celebratorily, and I was like, well, if you know me, you know I'm about abolishing the Supreme Court,
right.
right? If you know my politics, because the Supreme Court is an institution, again, built on indigenous genocide, built on enslavement, built on death dealing after death dealing system, and
Yes.
right. So I don't believe in our Constitution. I don't believe in our Declaration. I don't believe in any of these documents that profess to be democratic, just, or equitable.
Right.
So that being said, here's the but in. So now we have this accomplished, right, by all measures of professional accomplishment, qualified, highly qualified Black woman, and we see this moment of her being interrogated by these god-awful men and women, white women. And it is, for every Black woman I know who was watching, like I couldn't even watch it because I felt the harm that was happening in that moment. And even as I'm hypercritical of the Supreme Court and hypercritical of what it means to have one of us in a system that devours us,
yes,
I still felt for her. I still had this intimate connection and this exhale when the confirmation went through. And so there are multiple frequencies on which we experience that. And I think the representational is the one that is the easiest for the state, even when it's not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So see, here's this exception. It's possible right now that she did it. We all can. I was like, it literally actually means the opposite, right? All the shit she had to do just to be here at this point in history and this point in moment in history, that becomes possible. And all of the shit she will have to deal with, and all of the shit that, by extension, Black women and girls, because representational means so much to the state and to the apparatus. Where's the win-win, right? The win that I want to feel. And I am never dismissive of that, because when my mother called me and she's so excited, I affirm that. I affirm when Black women see themselves in particular places. I just want us to be clear about what those places are, and what those systems can do, and what we're asking this Black woman to be a part of and a part to. Like, I'm one of those people. I'm the auntie when a child's like, I want to be president of the United States. I was like, you want to run U.S. empire? Like, that's terrible to me. Like, right? It's built on such death dealing stuff. I'm like, now, unless you want to just give here and give all the land back on some real shit and have a robust reparations plan, I don't know why you'd want to be president, right? That's me where I am right now. But I'm also thinking about me 10 years ago and having that conversation with someone who probably would have been more thrilled. 15 years ago, I was working for the DNC and volunteering to get President Obama elected. So I recognize what that means and wanted to offer something to say it is a but and. It is a, what systems do we want to be integrated into, right? Why do we have so much faith in the systems that have been there? And why do we think an exceptional figure in those spaces fundamentally changes the harm doing that those systems do?
Right. One of the questions that I really wanted to ask you, Treva, was about, the book is about violence, and you do not cast this word safe or safety very often throughout the book. So I don't want to put that on the book, but I read this, I don't know how many months ago already, because, like you said, the pandemic time gets all confusing. But because of where we are, like I worry a bit more about my people who write things that the state most definitely, centrist, left of center, right of center, don't want. This is one of them books. The lefties don't want this book. The righties don't want this book, right? Like, because you asking a lot of, you appear to be asking a lot of us, and also you appear to be actually saying, like, I'm not asking you if that part of you is quote unquote guilty. I'm saying we are, and here's what we're going to do. But were you afraid at all of publishing this book? Like, I read your first book, and I was like amazed. I learned so much more about DC, and we've talked a lot. I've read your articles. this was the first time I read something of yours, and I think it also is because of the times. And I was just like, damn, I'm a little physically afraid. But is that a person? Can I ask you that question? Like, were you afraid to put this book out?
This may be the Northeast DC in me, but no.
Nah, you're like, nah, let's go.
I mean, I felt like this book came to me. Like it wasn't like, I'm going to write a book about this, right? There were just these things that kept happening. And even when at the beginning of 2020, when I was getting ready to like propose my next book, it was a book about the 90s. It was not this book.
Right.
Right. I really was, I was like, I'm not ready yet. I don't know. I'm not sure. And that wasn't necessarily fear. It's just like, I just knew emotionally what kind of toll doing this book would take.
Yes.
On me, like what it would take. And so I wasn't, and then we went on lockdown. And I was like, really? You really think I'm gonna write this book when I can't touch anybody? I can't see anybody.
Yeah.
And it ended up being an amazing time for me to write and to think through these things. But I'm very rarely worried about folks' response to that in that way. And I get perhaps that I should have been, but I felt like if I had, I wouldn't have written the book that I wrote.
I feel you.
It wouldn't have been as honest. It wouldn't have been as personal. I would have stuck to the safety of the archive and not interested in participating in the rebel archive practices of people like Thea Hartman and Sarah Haley and other amazing Black feminist historians. And I have the spirit of the folks I write about who are no longer here writing. Right? They're warring with me, and I wanted to go to war for them. Yeah. And so I feel like I have that fortifying around me and am prepared to defend what that is, go on the offensive if necessary. I don't know if those like, I'm the 80s, like we're the 80s crack babies. Like that's who we are. So you fuck with us if you want to.
Right.
It's more of the, fuck around and find out. I'm just not built like that with fear when it comes to riding for Black girls. And, people talk about ride or die instances. I'm a ride or live kind of chick. I want to ride and live for Black girls. Like I live for our videos, for our style, for our dynamism. I live for the ways that Black trans women push us to farther depths of radical politics and impulses. I live for the ways that Black folks across genders are pushing us beyond these strict gender binaries and thinking within these boxes. I ride and live for that. And so those who are committed to snuffing us out and killing us are going to have to contend with the fact that what I move through this world with is the spirit of riding and living.
Yes. And, one of the things that you do in this book, and again, like this is just my reading. This is what I think you do in this book. Everybody listening need to go out and buy 3 or 4 copies so you can come up with ideas of what Dr. Lindsey does in this book. But one of the things you do that I think is so dope is you talk about Nina Simone and how there was too much information for Mississippi Goddam, right? There was too much material. But like this is, in so many ways, like that's when the mushy KSA starts coming out early out in the book, because I'm like, that's our task, right? We all of this shit. How do we sift it down and make consumable art? So when I thought about this book, because you led with that anecdote, I'm interested in of all the time you spent in the archive, all the stories you wanted to tell of yours, of other people's. What can you talk about some of the stuff you had to necessarily not keep in this book for this book to maintain its integrity? And that might be something you go back to at some other point. Can you talk about what was cut out of this book?
Right. I had a great editor who reminded me it's comprehensive, not exhaustive, right? Yeah. That is what this is. So stuff around Black girls in schools that it's going to be its own chapter, right? Of thinking about the incredible violence that Black girls face in schools. Disciplinary. I'm thinking of Shakara being thrown across the room in Spring Valley, and Naya Kenny being the Black girl who witnesses with her and is subsequently criminalized for being this is wrong, right? I'm literally criminalized for that. And you know, the 6-year-old Black girl who's put in the back of a car and handcuffed, or the Black girl who missed a lesson in school and online and is arrested and put in juvenile detention, Grace in Michigan. Like, there were so many of those stories that I wanted to, and it wasn't about a choice of like, this is not as important or this is not as this. I cite in the book, right? That's not an area that I did in this book, and I point people towards some folks who are actively, like Monique, Nicole Brown, Bettina Love, Aria Holiday, working on Black girlhood stuff. I wanted to think about what it meant to tell some of these stories and actually to leave it as some. Like, if you're exhausted by this book, like, that should tell you something, because this is this much of what I could have said.
That's right.
Right? About my own story, about the stories of these women and girls and gender expansive people. You got this much, and I'm sure you'll put it down, because it was hard to write. And so there are all of these pieces that I still think in conversations with people, maybe a future project of just talking about all the stuff that didn't make it in America, goddamn, because goddamn, there was so much.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Simone had 3.5 minutes. I had 80,000 words, right? To really think through all of this. And so I tried to thread a story that really could resonate and open up more conversations, right? It opens up. It's not a closing. It's not an ending, but an invitation to struggling for justice with us, to learning more about what's happening, to deepening beyond statistics and data points, and to caring for and loving on the Black girls and women that are around us.
And the last question that I want to ask before we get Charis back up here to help sell these books is, you know, I think, like, in my own work, I'm torn, because I think I'm prone to writing pieces that feel like invitations. Invitations are by nature very hopeful or faithful, right? Yes. You know, you invite someone with the hope that they'll say yes, or faith that they will say yes, but with the understanding that they might probably say no. How do you deal with, like, writing a book like this, which feels to me like a multi-layered wonder construction of a plea? Like, right? Like, please, here's an invitation. An invitation isn't just to do. An invitation is to actually, like, work your way through this and to do so many different things. But is the invitation in and of itself shrouded in hope?
That's a great question. So I'm lucky that my schooling on hope comes through abolitionists like Miriam Akaba, and talking about hope as a discipline, right? And being steadfast in that hope. But I believe in us. I mean, more than I believe in anybody else. I believe in Black girls and women and gender expansive and agender and gender fluid. I believe in us. I've seen what we've done and the ways that we create and hold space for one another and create currents of warmth for one another in worlds that are so fucking cold and loving. And so for me, the hope comes in seeing what has already happened and the fact that we are freedom practicing right now.
Yes.
In spite of these things, right? And that's what keeps me disciplined in that struggle. And so if you reject my invitation, that's really still your loss. Because, like, we're gonna win, right? And that doesn't, the we I say is not temporally bound. This is not about whether I see this world coming to existence, but I believe in my responsibility of the world's yet to come. In which Black girls, Black women, queer folks, trans folks, marginalized folks, disabled folks are shaping and offering and loving and caring and building worlds that are just amazing, right? I believe in hope as a world-making project, not simply as like a hokey feeling that you have, like, come on and hope with us, it's better, but like, I'm hoping actively, so I'm world-making, I'm freedom practicing, I'm loving warmly, I'm caring warmly, I'm holding us warmly, because I believe in something, despite all the evidence, and that's where that faith comes in as well.
Yeah, I feel like every once in a while we get to see in real time our folks do with the genre something that it wasn't supposed to do. You know, and Arthur Jaffus, the artist, often talks about, like, anytime you invite Black folks to something, you're inviting Black folks to fuck that thing up. And I think you have fucked up the book, fam. Like, in in the most wondrous way. But it just makes me like fiend for everybody to fall into like this freedom searching, which is what I think this book really is about. And also I just can't wait to see what you do next. And selfishly, I do hope you fuck with the 90s, because I think you would mess me up. Like, you would show us something that we haven't seen. So I just want to say thank you for your work. Thank you for your friendship. You make me proud that I'm an OB alum. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this conversation, for such a really generous and generative read of my book. It's so deeply appreciated and warm and fam. So yes, the practice of famming.
That's it. Right. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This is a beautiful conversation. Thank you to everybody watching at home and for your thoughtful comments in the chat. I want to encourage y'all, if you don't yet have a copy of America Goddam, you can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy it from Charis. It really does help us when you buy books, particularly event books from us. So we appreciate it if you can do that. We also really recommend that you consider buying one and donating it to your public library. Or if you don't have the funds to do that, no worries. Request this book at your public library. That really helps authors. Also, since going back to college days, donate a copy of this to your collegiate library or to your child's library. One of the things we're seeing right now is all of this challenging of real history and trying to get books out of libraries. So this is such a key book that we need in high school and college libraries. It is accessible enough that young people can read it and should have access to it. So let's help make that happen, and definitely help Dr. Lindsey's book be an even greater success than it already is. So we can all do our part on that. So thank y'all so much for being here. Kiese, as always, we appreciate you and all that you do. And I hope that you both stay safe and well until next time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all. Buy from Charis, support Charis. They're amazing books that came out this week. So please, support.
Yes. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.